Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 15, Heading Home. Ruby was half surprised she had been allowed to remain in her current position for as long as she had, not that she was complaining at all. It could be 2 weeks until she saw her best friend again, so even if Weiss tried to struggle, Ruby would be getting her cuddles. Though admittedly, she was convinced that the only reason Weiss allowed the affection to continue so long was because the contact and her scarlet cape were blocking out the icy wind that still blew through Vale. The weather had finally dipped below freezing overnight, causing a thin layer of frost to cover the city, and despite Weiss' constant insistence that she was used to such weather, the girl had definitely been shivering when Ruby first initiated the hug. Behind her, Ruby knew that both Yang and Blake were likely rolling their eyes while watching them, but she didn't care. The only thing she cared about was showing Weiss how much she would miss her. "Ruby, this is really quite excessive," Weiss groaned, though her arms didn't move from their position on her back. "I must get going." "Your private airship takes off whenever you want," Ruby heard Blake said from behind her, with a small amount of humor in her tone. Feeling Weiss' hand leave her back and twist, Ruby tightened her grip on the heiress. Ruby had friends before, but never had she made a friend like Weiss. There was no denying that their relationship started out rocky, what with Ruby having literally blown the girl up. But as time went on, Weiss had slowly warmed up. She certainly was still rather cold on occasion, but she often tried her best to listen and give advice. As far as Ruby was concerned, the girl was not only living up to her promise of being a good teammate, but also a great friend. "All right," Weiss sighed, Ruby feeling a hand tugging at the back of her jacket. "For fear of your girlfriend misconstruing this situation, maybe you should take this display of affection over to her?" Like Ruby didn't give her enough affection at the party, Yang joked, causing Ruby to bury her head in the shoulder of her best friend to hide the blush. Last night had perhaps been one of the best nights of her whole life, right up there with the night Ojban had allowed her early entry into Beacon. To further add to said happiness, she had finally managed to push aside her awkwardness and kiss Blake. And not just once. The first at the party had been initiated by her, and in hindsight, she knew it had been sloppy and not the best, though it was still amazing to Ruby as it was her first. The second had been initiated by Blake at the door of their room once the party was over, and she could say without a doubt that it was much better than the first. The kiss had been a little more heated with Blake taking the lead, though there had still been no tongue, but was something Ruby allowed herself to melt into. That too had only lasted seconds, and was more something to say goodnight, and that they'd enjoyed the night. But the thought of Blake's hands on her hips as she reached up to meet the older girl's lips was still enough to cause her heart to race. However, while her face was buried in the crook of Weiss' shoulder, she felt a pair of strong arms wrap around her waist and lift her up. "Alrighty, sis," Yang said, as Weiss' hands pulled her arms away, and Yang carried her backwards, the cold air immediately pushing its way through the fabric of her jacket. "Stop holding Weiss up." Pouting as Yang placed her down on the seat of her bike, Ruby crossed her arms to show her sister her displeasure with having been so forcibly removed from her partner. The displeasure didn't last long, however, as Blake quickly sat beside her with a smile, and Yang took her turn to embrace the snowy-haired girl in a goodbye hug. "Don't let the assholes in Atlas get you down, okay?" Ruby heard Yang say as Weiss returned the hug before they quickly pulled apart. "I'll try my best not to skewer them." Weiss grinned as Yang moved away. "And I will try to get back before the break ends. Either way, we'll see you in 2 weeks." Blake smiled with a small wave that was returned by the heiress. The subtle goodbye probably the most expected thing in the world for two girls who avoided unnecessary contact where possible. "If I'm unlucky," Weiss groaned, handing off her bag to a man who approached after seeing his boss was no longer occupied by hugs. "Anyway, I really must be going. I will send a text when I get there." "No problem. Have a safe flight, bestie." Later. With one last sullen glance towards them, Weiss turned and walked away into the large crowd they'd escaped from. In less than a minute, the heiress' small frame was swallowed by the masses, and Ruby couldn't help but feel a little saddened by the sight. It wasn't a terribly long flight to Atlas from Vale, but with Grimm, there was always a chance that even a short flight could end in disaster. Thankfully, she felt a warm hand slip into hers, and turned to see Blake giving her a reassuring smile. "She'll be fine. That girl could handle a Queen Lancer if it dared to mess with her," the Faunus said with a firm certainty to her voice. "Yeah, don't worry, sis," Yang replied, picking up Zvi as she too sat down on the bike with the panting corgi on her lap. I'm sure Weiss will be back and scowling at us in no time. You're right, RWBY sighed, knowing that Blake and Yang were right, but still feeling a little worried too. Anyway, we should get home since it's still kinda cold. Are you cool coming with me and Zvi, Blake? An hour, why? I got Zvi, Rubes, Yang replied while unzipping her large jacket and pulling it open. Came prepared this time. Zvi in. On command, Zvi hopped into the open jacket, and Yang quickly zipped it back up to secure the little hound. There we go, he can keep me warm and enjoy the ride, while you two can cuddle all the way home. Just don't get caught, RWBY said and rolled her eyes as she stood up and addressed the adorable little puppy. You behave, okay. And duck your head if you see the cops. Receiving a small bark in return, Zvi ducked his head out of sight for a moment before popping back out with what RWBY knew to be a pleased look on his face. Giving him a quick pat on the head, RWBY moved away from the bike with Blake's hand still in hers, as Yang moved to straddle her pride and joy. A second later, the yellow bike roared to life as Yang gave the corgi a quick head scratch. I'll see you guys at home, she said, placing the helmet on her head and slipping her usual aviator over her eyes. Remember, people just finished their breakfast. You don't want to make them bring it back up with your PDAs. Blushing a little as she saw Yang's eyebrows wiggle over her aviator, RWBY heard the girl laugh to herself and take off with a cloud of dust, quickly pulling out of the car park and turning onto the road. With Yang and Weiss gone, RWBY and Blake were finally alone for the first time since the dance, and RWBY was surprised to find that there wasn't much awkwardness remaining. And what awkwardness did remain was a result of Yang's comment triggering the memory of the night before for both of them. Shaking her head free of the memory, though she would have happily allowed herself to get lost in it were she not so cold, RWBY turned to Blake with a smile, unsure if the pink tinting the girl's cheeks was because of the cold or the memory. Feeling her innards warm at the smile she received in return, she motioned toward the line of taxis that were waiting nearby and took off at a quick pace as she knew they always had the heating on. Blake looked around as they stepped off the boat, the beautiful island of Patch filling her vision for the first time. It was so different from the city, with no massive buildings or busy streets. Even the docks that she stepped onto held barely more than 20 people. With trees surrounding almost every building, it almost felt more like she had stepped into Vale's attempt to design their own menagerie than anything else. Admittedly, the winter strip trees of Patch were nothing like the perpetually green trees of home, but she could imagine that, had she been visiting during summer, everything would have been so much greener. Not that the leafless trees detracted from the beauty at all, they simply altered it. Instead of brilliant vibrance, the island held a more subtle, peaceful visage that was easily capable of putting her at ease. As she felt her body relax, the chill of the slight wind caused her to shiver and clamp her fingers tighter over RWBY's warm digits. Glancing to her side, she saw the Reaper gazing at her with a silent question in her eyes, clearly waiting for her opinion on her home island. It's nice, Blake replied honestly, giving the girl a smile and receiving one in return. Hard to believe it's part of Vale. I thought you liked Vale? The redhead said in confusion as the two of them stepped forward, Blake letting RWBY take the lead. It's fine. Blake grinned and gave her arms a slight flick so that the sleeves of her jacket slipped down to cover her bare skin. Just very uniform. And gray. I guess that's true. RWBY chuckled, quickly turning off the pathway and into the forest next to it. Are we not getting a car? They can't get up to our house. Yang's bike only just makes it, the girl replied, her voice punctuated by the cracking of the frost-hardened twigs beneath their feet. I'm glad I got my hair cut though. Long hair in the woods is a pain. Well, I guess I should be careful then. Blake laughed, gaining an apologetic look as she reached up to tuck her hair beneath her jacket. The conversation subsided just as quick as it began, and Blake was more than happy to fall into an easy stride beside the girl. My girlfriend. The thought was cut off just as soon as it began, as Blake had no idea if they could be considered that yet. Sure, they had kissed a couple of times, and those kisses had been wonderful, but it was still a decision they would need to talk about. Blake knew that she herself was more than willing to start using the title, however. The party the night before had been more than enough to confirm to her that she was happier than she'd been in years. The thoughts were there for a while, in fact, and not just because of RWBY, but as she danced and laughed with the young Reaper, she couldn't help wishing that the night would never end. Unfortunately, it had, but not before Blake had stolen a second kiss. The first they'd shared was incredible, albeit clearly RWBY's first, and Blake had felt her stomach flutter at the girl's way of reassuring her that she wasn't feeling pressured. The second one, however, was a selfish one born of a desire for more contact, but Ruby had happily gone with it. And as clumsy as the first had been, the girl was certainly a quick learner, as there had been no problems with the second. Allowing a smile to pull at her face, Blake looked to her side and saw Ruby staring ahead with intensity. Turning to see where the girl was looking, she saw a small puff of smoke coming from the ground ahead of them. She recognized it instantly, having come across them numerous times over the years, and wasn't surprised to see Ruby digging into her pocket and pulling out a handful of bullets. Sorting through them, she held up one marked with a red band, but quickly put it back and selected one marked with blue instead. "I hate termites," Ruby groaned and pulled Crescent Rose from her back to slip the bullet into the chamber. "They almost burned our house down once. I've seen them burn down entire camps," Blake replied as they came to the smoke and Ruby offloaded the round into the hole. Before the hole was covered in ice, Blake saw the wriggling red and black bodies of the tiny Grimm. Small embers littered the bottom of the hole that Blake knew could eventually cause a huge fire if the colony was left unattended. Fortunately, Ruby's bullet froze them all instantly, and they faded to dust as the ice cracked to emit the small black fog, as per usual with the death of a Grimm. "Yeah, Dad usually patrols the woods to take out as many as he can," Ruby sighed and put the sniper sight back onto her belt. "I guess he still isn't back." Ruby's hand slipped back into her own as they continued through the woods, the earthy scent of dead leaves filling her senses as she crushed twigs underfoot and pushed aside low-hanging branches. An eerie silence hung in the air now that they were away from the docks and civilization, serving as yet another difference from Menagerie, where it was so packed that there was nowhere you could go on the island without hearing people. "Almost there." Ruby grinned after they finished climbing a rather steep hill that would have given any non-huntress quite a workout. "Sorry, it's a little out of the way." "It's all right." Blake smiled and turned to look over the path they had just taken to see a river a short distance from it. "The longer we take, the more time we have away from Yang's teasing." "That is a very good point." Ruby laughed and joined her. "It sucks that the first time you see patches when it looks like this. The bonus of reading is that I have a very good imagination." Blake chuckled, feeling Ruby nuzzle against her side a little more. "It's not hard to imagine everything in front of me as green and full of life." "It's not just green," Ruby said with a shake of her head, and pointed out to the river and slowly swept sideways. "Around there is." Her hand stopped on a clearing among some trees. "But that clearing grows so many flowers in the spring that the floor looks like a painter's paint board thing." "Palette?" "Yeah, that." Ruby nodded with a smile. "I used to spend hours down there every day because all the colors together look so pretty. But as you get to town," her hand pointed to a few faint buildings in the distance, "it gets really white since Patch's official flower is a tulip and people put them everywhere. And up there." Ruby's hand came to a stop of a far-off cliff that stood alone, the large outcrop that was overlooking the ocean visible even from their current position. With a quick glance to her side to see why Ruby had stopped talking, she saw the girl's face had dropped a little. She was certainly still smiling, but a hint of mourning had taken hold of it. "For 3 months of the year, that entire cliff is covered in gold grass." Suddenly, the intrusive emotion on Ruby's face made sense. During one of her outing with Yang, the blonde had mentioned their mother had been buried on a cliff of gold grass. Blake had considered it exceptionally beautiful when she'd heard it, as gold grass was rather rare and only grew in small patches. Unfortunately, the flora was rather weak, and always wilted in the winter. "I'm sure it looks beautiful," she said quietly, giving Ruby a smile and squeezing her hand. "It does." Ruby sighed and turned away with a shiver. "Anyway, we should get going. I'm freezing, and I need a hot chocolate." "That does sound pretty good, not gonna lie." Blake smiled, allowed Ruby's hand to pull her along before catching up. "How far is it?" "Just a couple of minutes," Ruby said, though a playful grin overtook her face as she stopped and turned to face her while biting her lip adorably. Unless we race. Except I have no idea where I would be going," Blake said with a raised eyebrow. Clearly set on the idea, Ruby pointed to a large tree on a hill off in the distance. Unlike the rest of them, there were clearly still a few leaves clinging to it. It wasn't incredibly far, but the distance as great enough that Blake was confident Ruby's semblance could only carry her part of the way. Once that was done, Blake could certain she could catch up. However, a race was a competition, and competitions had prizes. Okay, Blake said teasingly and took a step forward. And what does the winner get? Ruby flustered for a split second, her lips slipping from the hold her teeth had on it, but she quickly caught herself. The grin on her face widened a little as a red blush settled on her cheeks. I can think of something, Ruby said nervously. Blake hummed, knowing what Ruby was thinking as she had barely stopped thinking about it herself. If it's what I think, I can definitely agree to that. Ruby bit her lip again, and Blake took another step forward. They may have settled on a prize, but it couldn't hurt to try for a little one now, and for a moment, Blake almost thought Ruby was going to let her. But as she drew close enough that silver filled her vision, the young reaper gave a wink and petals exploded in her face. Taken aback by the sneaky move, Blake turned to chase the blur of red that was weaving through the trees. Jumping into action immediately, Blake took off at a sprint. Thanks to her training, she knew she was rather fast, but so was Ruby. The girl would undoubtedly use her semblance where she could to get an edge, so Blake did the same. Every 10 strides when she had a straight shot before the next tree, she would leave a shadow, using the small amount of propulsion she normally used to double jump to give her a momentary burst of speed. But it was nothing compared to the speed Ruby had, so knowing she had to do a little more, she steered herself to a large, slanted rock nearby and draw her weapon as she used it to leap into the air. In less than a second, her weapon was in its sickle form, and she effortlessly slung it out at a nearby branch, the metal jamming into the bark firmly enough that she pulled herself along. With every few trees, she would mimic her actions from the ground with her semblance, though this time pushing herself off the wood to keep her momentum. Thankfully, it was enough, and she soon saw Ruby slightly ahead of her, the red blur of her cape and dexterity of how she moved through trees unchanged though she had stopped using her semblance. Out of the corner of her eye, Blake saw Ruby glance over her shoulder, and Blake swore she could see a mischievous smile. It was a smile she should have paid more attention to as the girl once again burst into rose petals, though this time they were headed straight up into the treetops. Had the smile not still been in the forefront of her mind, she would have recognized the red ball sooner, but she didn't. Her brain finally clicked just before it struck a branch and exploded, filling the area with red petals that obscured everything in front of her. Cheater, Blake laughed in her own head, more happy that Ruby had successfully pulled off something she had been practicing for a while than the fact it was a dirty trick. Thankfully, it was easy enough to avoid, but it did cost her time she couldn't afford and allowed Ruby to pull ahead more. Unfortunately, the great tree was quickly approaching, so Blake pushed herself into high gear. From her higher terrain, she had the advantage of landing higher up the hill, but Ruby quickly caught up as she corrected herself. But it was the last stretch, so darting after the girl, who was within arm's reach, Blake tried her best to pull ahead. Unfortunately, she knew it was lost as Ruby looked over her shoulder again and stuck out her tongue, once again bursting into a small cloud of petals and immediately covering the remainder of the ground. Ha! The shout was full of victory, and Blake came to the top of the hill and caught her breath, not that the run had been particularly strenuous. Looking up from her crouched position, she saw Ruby punching the air before falling against the tree. Fastest team leader ever. Biggest cheater ever. Blake chuckled and straightened herself out. Nah, Ruby said and stuck her tongue out again. We didn't make any rules. That is a lousy excuse. Blake laughed and made her way over to the Happy Reaper. However, I do think we talked about a prize. Blake wasn't sure if the scarlet of Ruby's cheeks was from the exercise or embarrassment, but the girl didn't make any attempt to move as Blake approached. In less than a second, the silver once again filled her vision and Blake pressed her lips against Ruby's, the feeling of sparks rushing through her as the girl quickly returned the affection. Blake was still hesitant, of course, and didn't push the limits too far, but for almost a minute the two of them enjoyed each other's embrace in the solitude of the forest. Once the urge to go a little further arose, however, Blake pulled away and smiled down at the now certainly blushing leader. Congrats on the petal burst, though, she breathed, still not moving away despite the broken kiss, the smile and glint of the girl's silver eyes keeping her spellbound. Thanks, Ruby stuttered in return, her hand still gently holding Blake's waist. It's easier when I'm happy. Well, I'm glad you feel that way with me, Blake whispered, relieved that she definitely hadn't pushed a little too hard by kissing her so suddenly. I do, Ruby said, clearly wanting to make sure Blake believed her. Giving Ruby a wide smile of her own, Blake rested a hand against the girl's cheek and felt the urge to go for another. And after seeing Ruby bite her lip and tilt her head, she felt emboldened to go through with it. Unfortunately, just before their lips touched again, a loud shout drew her out of the moment. "Oi, lovebirds! Plan on joining me soon?" Confused as to how Yang had found them, she looked to her side to see a large wooden house stood in the center of a clearing on the opposite side of the hill. She'd been so caught up in the happiness of the moment that the surrounding area had seemingly melted away for a while. However, now that she was aware of it, she could see the figure of the blonde staring up at them with her hands on her hips surrounded by what looked to be destroyed patio furniture. "Looks like we are caught," Blake groaned and pulled back. "Looks like she had some fun of her own though." "Probably a Beowulf," Ruby stammered, also clearly a little embarrassed at having been caught. "They are always sniffing around." Once Ruby straightened her jacket, she reached her hand out, and Blake was more than happy to take it. After a couple of seconds smiling at each other and properly registering how perfect everything had just felt, the two of them began to make their way down the hill to help the blonde clean up the yard. Chapter 16, Desires, Part 1. Ruby was suddenly jolted awake as a large mass caused her mattress to shift and wake her from an excellent dream. Despite her groggy state, she knew exactly who it was and kicked out with her legs to get rid of them. She had been so happy to be back in her bed again, the soft mattress much more comfortable than the one at Beacon, and seeing how she was on break, she'd hoped to sleep in a little. Unfortunately, just like always, Yang didn't care and simply laid horizontally across her body instead. Letting out a loud groan, Ruby tried to raise her legs to shove her sister away, but the girl was much heavier and stronger and refused to budge. "Yang!" Ruby whined, trying to pull her sheets up over her head only to find them also trapped beneath her brutish sister. "Let me sleep." "No can do, lazy butt," Yang said happily, twisting her body so that she could reach up and pull the blanket down. "Time to get up." 10 more minutes," Ruby pleaded, still not opening her eyes, as she could already tell that bright sunlight was filling the room. Yang hummed while moving again. The hand holding the covers slipped to the side and ripped them open, and Ruby let out a loud, disgruntled moan. However, just as she thought she would have to actually wake up, she felt a warm body slip in behind her and cover them both back up. "Fine, 10 minutes," Yang said in resignation, and Ruby felt her sister cuddle up to her. "You're lucky I love ya." "MHM," Ruby hummed, nestling back into the perpetual warmth of her sister. She couldn't count how often they had been in the exact same position growing up. In fact, she could barely recall a morning before she turned 10 when she hadn't woken up with Yang in her bed. A large wave of comfort rushed through her at those memories. After her 10th, Yang had stopped doing it so much, but it wasn't uncommon for it to still occur at least once a week. After a couple of years, though, it had practically stopped for the most part and was a rare luxury that she still enjoyed when she could. "It feels good being home again," Ruby sighed, her eyes still shut. "I miss my bed." "It's a good bed," Yang said, the daunting sound of upcoming torment entering her tone. "So what were you dreaming about?" "And nothing," Ruby said, covering her stutter with a yawn, as she knew exactly what she had been dreaming about. "Well, you were certainly smiling a lot for nothing," Yang teased. "Or was it actually a certain raven-haired teammate of ours?" "Shut up," Ruby groaned, jutting her arm back into her sister's stomach despite knowing the action would do little but confirm Yang's question. "You know you mutter about Coco and Velvet in your sleep too." "That's because my dreams of them are excellent." "You? Gross, Yang." "All clean dreams," Yang chuckled, fingers grazing across Ruby's stomach and pulling a small laugh from her. "When did you start getting such a dirty mind, huh?" "When I was 13, Ruby admitted, feeling a small blush on her cheeks. "Oh." The reply hung between them with an air of awkwardness as Yang's fingers stopped their tickling. After a couple of seconds, though, she felt Yang let out a deep breath. "I guess we never really had that talk, did we?" "I don't need that talk, Yang," Ruby said quickly, not wanting to have such an embarrassing discussion. "I know." Yang sighed and wrapped an arm tightly around her. "Guess it's just hard seeing you really start to grow up. Not just with that stuff, but everything else too. Makes me feel like my days of being the person you go to for help are coming to an end." Those words hung in the air too. It was very rare for Yang to voice her worries to Ruby, just as rare as it was for them to spend the morning cuddling. she often hated how Yang bottled things up, keeping them to herself until she inevitably got so angry that she went off and took it out on something. It was because of that rarity that Ruby took care to think about how she could settle her sister's mind. After a minute, she budged a little closer to her sister. "I'm a 16-year-old who still reads comics and regularly eats myself sick with cookies," Ruby grinned. "I'm pretty sure you have a few more years." "Good," Yang breathed with a hint of relief that made Ruby happy. "'Cause I have a lot more wisdom left in me still." Ruby scoffed playfully and slowly stretched, finally admitting that she wasn't getting back to sleep. "Weiss isn't here to laugh at your jokes." As she felt Yang's body shake with small chuckles, Ruby opened her eyes and instantly regretted it as light burned her retinas. Rubbing them clear of the spots, Ruby let her eyes slowly adjust and was surprised to see the outline of her girlfriend standing in the doorway watching them nervously. Once she noticed she was caught, she straightened up and awkwardly rubbed one of her arms. "Morning," the girl said with a meek smile. "Morning." Ruby blushed, wondering just how much the girl had heard. "I think the sneaky little kitten was eavesdropping on us, Rubes," Yang teased, causing Blake to roll her eyes at the blonde. "So how was the patrol?" "Fine." Blake shrugged and Ruby saw a leaf fall from the girl's hair, something that Blake clearly saw too. "Couple of beowulfs, but nothing I couldn't handle. There were some weird gouge marks on some of the trees though. A little too far apart to be from claws. Ugh, for scratches about hand's length apart?" Blake gave a short nod, causing Yang to groan and sit up, Ruby knowing exactly why. "The stupid Helk is back." "Helk?" "Just what we call it," Ruby said with a whine as Yang's movement shifted the covers and allowed cold air to rush between them. "A massive elk like Grim. Dad's been trying to kill it for years, but it always retreats and comes back stronger." Yang yawned and slipped out of the bed. "Come on, lazy, you've had your 10 minutes. I'm doing breakfast." "Has your dad never hunted it down?" "Too much hassle." Ruby yawned due to her sister and finally sat up to stretch properly. "Plus, it's really freaking strong." "Yeah, best not to follow that thing back to its lair," Yang confirmed and poked Blake in the stomach as she walked out of the room. "Bacon and eggs good with you?" "Sure." "Good. You two can sort out the backyard while I'm cooking." "Hey! I'm the team leader!" Ruby shouted after her sister, only for Yang's head to pop around the door again. "And I'm in charge of the house till Dad gets back," she said strictly. "Now come on. Up." Sticking her tongue out as Yang's head disappeared from sight, Ruby heard a small chuckle from Blake and gave her a smile. Their eyes connected for a minute, and a slight awkwardness filled the room. This wasn't their dorm room. It wasn't a shared space where they always saw each other. It was her actual room, and she was still wearing her pajamas. Though she knew Blake wasn't looking, she still felt a little shy at the exposed skin and the privacy of it, and clearly Blake caught on and looked away with a cough. "Sorry," she said quietly and backed out of the room. "I will leave you to get dressed." "All right," Ruby said awkwardly. "I won't be long." With a short nod, Blake walked out of view, and Ruby let out a loud sigh and collapsed back into her comfortable bed. Every time she looked at Blake since the kiss at the tree, she couldn't help but think back to how it had felt. It was much more heated than their first two, and while Blake was still obviously trying not to go too fast, Ruby's lips still tingled as she thought of it. She knew all about the body reacting to the stimulus, but she had never expected the reaction to be so strong. She had practically melted into the kiss, the feeling making her mind rush so much and making her want to just stay there forever. The way Blake's body pressed lightly against hers had made her whole body heat up like a furnace, her stomach to flip, and had it continued any longer, Ruby knew she would have let her hand snake around Blake's back to pull her closer. Just thinking about it again made her flush. Unfortunately, Blake was waiting, and they needed to get the garden sorted before breakfast was done, so giving her head a shake in an unsuccessful attempt to rid herself of the thoughts, she let out a loud groan and reluctantly pushed herself out of bed. A cold breeze blew past Ruby as she opened the door to the garden and stepped outside. Despite the sun being completely hidden, its light still brightened the clouds enough to sting her eyes, so she quickly raised a hand to block them out. Thankfully, the weather itself wasn't too bad outside of the breeze, so she had been able to do with a simple red hoodie and a pair of jeans. Scanning the tree line, she saw Blake knelt by the scattered lawn furniture. Even from where she was, Ruby could see that it was broken beyond repair, and Blake clearly realized it too as she picked up the splintered wood and turned around this a shrug. Despite the broken furniture, she couldn't help but give the girl a smile. "I don't think we are fixing this," Blake said with a sigh and placed it into a bag. "That's like the 1,000th chair they've broken." Ruby shrugged and moved over to help pick up the remaining shrapnel, only to find one piece was scorched. "Though I'm pretty sure we are cleaning up after Jan right now. Aren't we always?" Blake chuckled. Smiling at her girlfriend's words, Ruby looked up and regretted it immediately. Butterflies erupted in her stomach the moment her eyes caught Blake's amber orbs, and the thoughts she had successfully cleared from her mind came rushing back. Is this how it's always going to be? She asked herself with an inward groan. It wasn't that she didn't like how Blake made her feel, because she really did. It was more of an issue because it was so debilitating. Every look, every word, every slight touch set Ruby's mind racing and make her want to continue what had been left at the tree, and she was still struggling with calming it down. "I do remember you saying grim attacks were common out here." "For us, yeah." Ruby nodded and moved to pick up another piece of wood, glad of an excuse to look away. "They tend to avoid the main town due to the defenses, but since we're on the outskirts." "I see," the raven-haired faunus replied with a hum. "Your dad never thought to get some defenses here?" "Nah, it would be a waste of money," Ruby said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "He's a pro huntsman. So is my uncle who visits regularly, and both me and Yang are in training. The odd Beowulf or Ursa were just good practice. Even Zai fights grim." "That is a very good point." Blake laughed and picked up the towel that usually hung over the now destroyed furniture, though Ruby noticed one of the cat ears twitch. "You hear something?" she asked curiously, and held open the bag for Blake. "I think a twig snapped northwest. Might be mistaken though." Spy." At her call, the corgi bounced from the house, his tongue lolling the side, and Ruby pointed to the direction Blake had said. "Go check." Without hesitation, the small hound ran off towards the forest with a small yip. Ruby remembered how the sight of watching Zai bound into the woods to hunt Grim would terrify her as a child, how she would always fear he would never return and her precious puppy would be gone forever. However, as the years went on, she'd learned that he always returned. While he was perfectly fine fighting Grim, he would never do it unless he had a human at his side. So knowing it would take a couple of minutes for him to return, she continued to clear up the yard with Blake. "There's likely gonna be a couple days of fighting them off," Ruby said, fully expecting to hear a loud bark from the woods at any moment. "They always try to take over the area when we leave for more than a day." "Well, I'm sure we can handle them," Blake smiled kindly. The smile went unnoticed, however, as Ruby had just spotted something else that was broken and quickly made her way towards it. Dropping to her knees, she let out a small sigh and lifted the small ceramic shard gently off the ground. Like the furniture, the ceramic wall was cracked in numerous places and would take a lot of effort to fix, as with the rosebush that was now crushed to death. A slight sadness washed over Ruby as she looked at the messed-up flower bed. "Everything okay?" Blake asked, a hand landing comfortingly on her shoulder. "This was my mom's," Ruby said sadly, and tried to place the shard back where it came from, only for another piece to fall away. "It's never been broke before." "Oh." The hand on her shoulder squeezed reassuringly before leaving it as Blake walked away. Hearing a rustle behind her, she was about to look behind her when Blake reappears and crouched down beside her with the towel they had thrown away. Quickly placing it on the floor, she began piling the broken shards onto the fabric, and recognizing what she was doing, Ruby placed the pieces in her hand onto the towel. With all the stray pieces collected, Blake carefully folded the towel and placed it aside. "Ceramic doesn't shatter like glass, so it's not too bad," Blake said quietly. "I know," Ruby said with a sad nod. "The rose bush will need replanting though. This little park always felt sacred. No matter how many Grim came, it never got damaged. Like Mom was protecting it." "I'm sorry." The fauna sighed and gave her a small hug. "I'm sure Jan will happily remake it. Why?" Bark. Bark. Blake was cut off as Zai's loud bark echoed around the area, and Ruby spanned to see the corgi running full speed out of the forest, almost immediately followed by a large mantid. The grotesque black Grim skittered across the ground on its 6 legs as it dragged its large peapod body behind it. At the top of its thin body were a pair of razor-sharp, serrated, white claws that could cut through flesh as if there were no resistance, and from the mouth, set below two bulbous red eyes, dripped a green liquid that Ruby knew was acid strong enough to melt bone on contact. Acting before Blake could even stand up, Ruby pulled her sniper scythe from behind her back and quickly fired a shot at its head. The brown bullet exploded as it impacted on the white skull to cover the entire head in a hard stone. Wasting no time, Ruby unfolded her scythe and activated her semblance to zoom towards the creature. It may not have been the one to destroy the flower bed, may not have even been in the vicinity, but by the gods was it going to pay for what its kind had done. Chapter 17, Desires, Part 2. Ruby felt the fast wind push her hood down as she soared towards the creature at breakneck speeds. All it would take is one strike through the Manid Grimm's thin body, and it would be cleaved in half, usually a rather difficult thing to do, but that was why she'd made sure to encase its head in stone first. Blind and strike was always the best tactic for a solo Grimm. So rearing her side back as she approached, she swung forwards in a graceful arc to slice the thing in two. Unfortunately, just as what tended to happen, not everything went to plan. Though the Grimm remained blinded, it turned to face away from her and brought its armor-covered abdomen up to block the hit. Feeling the side glance off the armor, she shifted her weight enough to let it roll along the long body and fired off another shot, this one sending her spinning into the air. Landing a short distance away facing the creature, she saw the rock around its head crumble, and a small flood of viscous green liquid fell to the floor, smoke rising as the grass withered at its touch. With no downtime at all, the 9-foot-tall creature flattened its body and began to charge at her. Seeing movement from the corner of her eye, Ruby jumped. As if by instinct, her arm reaching out to grab the sickle that had been thrown, and was immediately pulled away from the grotesque insect just in time to avoid the abdomen as it twisted to hit her again. Landing next to Blake, she saw the creature crash through a table that had somehow survived Yang's tussle the previous day. "I've never fought one of these," Blake said quickly as the thing was already starting to recover. "What should I look out for?" "Sharp claws, acid spit, and its mandibles are like a vice," Ruby relayed quickly. "Aim for the thin thorax. Movement and vision? 360 vision, but kinda slow. Its abdomen weighs a ton and slows it down, but also hits hard. Stay moving, God." Blake's words were cut off as they both jumped to the side to avoid a stream of liquid, the heat of the searing concoction warming Ruby's cheek despite being out of its range. Time for relaying information was over, and Ruby stepped forward to intercept the already close Grimm. It may have been slow by Grimm standards, but it was still faster than your average animal and could close gaps quickly when needed. As a claw descended upon her, she gave Crescent Rose a spin to knock it away with the butt of the side's hook and allowed the momentum to drag her backwards, out of the range of the other claw that had followed. Flipping backward, she dug the tip of her weapon into the grass to anchor herself and fired off a shot the moment her feet hit solid ground, the bullet striking the white, armored head and forcing it to recoil. Not wasting a second of the opening, Blake ran past her and made an attempt at the thin body only for a pair of wings to erupt behind it and flutter hard enough to drag it backward, causing her strike to miss. Correcting herself instantly with a slight pirouette, she raised her sword to block the downward strike of the two claws and effortlessly rolled to the side. Seeing an opening, Ruby fired another shot only for the creature to duck below it. Just like before, it began to charge. This time she waited until it was close before jumping to land on its heavy abdomen, but before she could do anything it had already raised its head and span it completely around to look at her. Glowing red bore into her own silver, and she knew she couldn't dodge as a jet of acid hit her chest, so activated her aura instead. Feeling the liquid burn despite her aura protecting her from actual harm, Ruby jumped back and landed near the broken table just as another stream was sent her way. This time she was prepared and her scythe was already in motion, the two fangs of the hook digging into the broken table top and bringing it up to block the attack, the wood bursting into flames instantly. To compensate for its legs unable to turn it quick enough, the vein of black wings erupted from its back again and lifted it an inch off the ground, but Blake was ready. Using her own semblance to boost her speed, she sprinted past and slashed out, her blade cutting the thin wings off and grounding it. Seemingly annoyed by this, the mantid leaped forward in an attempt to crush her, but Blake merely faded into shadow, and the real one appeared at Ruby's side. "It's being too defensive for us to get to the thorax. We need those claws out of the way," Ruby said, wiping the gunk off her front so she could conserve more aura. "I can do that if you can get the body." "I'll follow your lead." Blake nodded, her words punctuated by a small chattering as the creature turned to face them again. I only have 3 rounds left, so give me cover fire until I create an opening, RWBY instructed as the Grim sized them up, knowing that Blake had more ammunition on her than she did. You'll know when to strike. Blake collapsed her weapon into its gun mode at the order and took off to the right, while RWBY sped straight at the creature. As she predicted, it tried for another downward strike, and she nimbly dodged it with a simple lean and brought her side up. Once again, the beast went into a defensive stance and caught the blade with its other claw, attempting to toss her aside. Taking it in stride, she leapt up to let the force carry her body around and shove both of her feet into the creature's face. It didn't do much due to the size difference, but it was enough for her to push herself away and slip Crescent Rose free just as 3 shots collided with the white plating. Not wanting to waste the opening, RWBY fired off a shot of her own as she landed, and the creature stumbled from the impact. With that, however, came its abdomen, which swung around at such a speed that RWBY barely managed to jump up in time. Barely clearing the incoming object, her scythe hooked around a leg and severed it cleanly, as more shots from Blake landed in the back of the vile thing's head. With it off balance and injured, RWBY knew she was ready and rolled back into range of its claws. They were the only way through, as any attack from behind would be met with acid, and she needed to do as she said and get them out of the way. With its mobility hindered, the creature scuttled backwards a little and RWBY advanced, her scythe slashing out, but each attack was blocked by the creature's quick claws. With each deflection, the mantid would try for one of its own, but she danced her way between them, as Blake littered the insect's head with bullets to keep it confused. Finally, she saw her opening. The creature tried to lay its body down on top of her, but she repelled it with another smack from the butt of her weapon's head which, just as she planned, was blocked. The block forced the mantid to rear up further, its claws going above its head, and with a graceful spin, she let her scythe head crack back into its extended form and cleaved a perfect diagonal arc towards the thorax. She didn't intend it to kill as she knew it would be blocked again, but it was that block she needed. The claws instantly shot back down and caught it as the body flattened to the ground, and the vice-like mandibles clamped down on the blade. That was the creature's last mistake. Triggering the transform mechanism that she had purposely designed to have a little more kick than it probably should have, she hopped and let the force pull her around as Crescent Rose straightened out. Once it was locked into place in its normal form, she let herself fall a little while holding the grip and jammed her feet against the back of the Grim's head while pulling her scythe back and letting off another shot. The kickback caused the grip of Crescent Rose to jump backwards, making the creature's whole torso bend until she was laid against the armor of its large abdomen. With its head unable to turn due to her feet keeping it locked facing away, and its claws unable to defend its thorax, it was practically defenseless. And Blake didn't miss a beat. Before RWBY's back was even fully against the armor, Blake appeared in the air, her weapon sheathed and spinning fast. RWBY recognized the move and at the opportune time fired off a shot, her last bullet, that struck the end of Blake's sheath, the extra force making her spin even faster as she descended until the moment came. Less than a meter away, she unsheathed her weapon in one fluid movement, and both her blades struck their mark, cutting through the thorax like butter and leaving behind a trail of purple light from the force of the attack. Feeling the slack as the body split in two, RWBY tumbled backwards, but quickly turned it into a roll, landing on her feet in time to see the Grim fading into smoke. The battle had not been long, not much more than a minute in fact, but RWBY couldn't help but breathe deeply. Mantids weren't the hardest Grim ever, but even the weak ones still put up a hell of a fight. Not too bad, RWBY heard Blake say, while she was bent over and checking her precious scythe for scratches. Seeing none, she let out a relieved breath and straightened herself up. I still prefer bow. Blake cut out and quickly turned around, but not before RWBY saw her eyes narrow and her ears flatten. Looking around for what had caused such a reaction, she quickly found it and blushed a deep scarlet. She thought she removed all the acid from her chest before turning her aura off, but it appeared she had missed a bit, and it had burned a hole in her hoodie. Almost the entire left side of her bra and part of her stomach were visible, and Blake had received a full shot of the lacy material that was just as scarlet as her face likely was. Idiot, she thought to herself as she covered herself up and turned away from Blake to head into the house and get a new hoodie that didn't expose her so much. Idiot! Yang's scolding words caused RWBY to visibly flinch as the blonde shoveled bacon into the Reaper's plate, RWBY quickly picking up a piece and sucking on it with a frown. What has Dad said about rushing in without a plan? I had a plan, Ruby countered, though the sting of her tone was lost as she was clearly enjoying the food. It just didn't work out, so I made another. It's not like you ever have a plan. I always have a plan, Yang replied and turned back to get the eggs. Punch it till it dies isn't a plan, Blake answered, taking a bite of her own food. Yang may not seem like the kind, but she was actually a rather decent cook. More a motto than anything. Don't you take her side. The boxer scowled and scooped an egg onto her sister's plate. I was watching from here. She rushed in foolishly and gave the advantage to the manted. She did, Blake admitted, earning a sad look from her girlfriend. But she knew I was there to help fill in the gaps, and was quick to correct her plan. Signs of a good leader if you ask me. Yang glared at her for a second, though the action was clearly for show as there was no annoyance behind her lilac eyes, until she finally let out a sigh and placed what was left of the food onto a third plate and sat down at the table. This is gonna happen a lot now, isn't it? What? Ruby asked. You two siding with each other. Probably. Blake smirked at her partner as a pained look passed over her eyes. Get used to it. I can't believe I miss Weiss already, Yang replied with a roll of her eyes. Feeling a little smile pull at her lips, Blake continued pecking at her food as the three of them passed idle chit-chat. She still couldn't remember when it had started to feel so normal to joke and mess around with her team, but she couldn't say she disliked it. It felt like years since she'd had anything of the sort, as even her final years in the White Fang were barely spent with anyone she considered friends. The team certainly had their falling outs or disputes, like Yang's earlier annoyance, but they always passed, and Blake always felt a sigh of relief when they did. Ruby and Yang were the biggest example of that. Most likely due to them being sisters, the two fell out with each other constantly over very minor stuff such as broken mugs or ripped pictures, but the fights rarely lasted a day before they were laughing with each other again. Every relationship on the team seemed to have taken on those aspects too, the minor falling outs, the quick mending of fences, and it was more confirmation to Blake that they were becoming what Yang had said at the party. They weren't friends to her anymore, they were sisters. With the exception of Ruby, of course. People didn't feel about their sisters how Blake felt about Ruby, well, not most people anyway. Ruby had become something more altogether. She was her first thought when she woke up in the morning, the person who drew her eyes without fail when she entered a room. Talking to her was more than enough to put a smile on her face, and she found herself seeking those moments more and more. It scared her a little as she remembered just how fast she had fallen for Adam, but she also found comfort in knowing Ruby was nothing like that. With Ruby she could be herself, and didn't have to worry about hiding things or appearing strong. That wasn't to say she wasn't still holding back though in a few areas though. Blake still wasn't sure what Ruby was ready for or not, and didn't want to push anything. Kissing seemed fine, Ruby even seemed to like when Blake kissed her, but even those kisses were a little tame. But then, there were other things that, while knowing they were very far away, Blake couldn't stop invading her mind. Like the incident that had taken place less than an hour ago. Despite how she portrayed herself, Blake certainly wasn't void of desire. That much would be obvious to anyone who looked at her book collection. But after noticing the state of Ruby's hoodie, Blake had to practically force herself to turn around to be respectful. It may as well have been more than she had seen when Ruby accidentally poked her head out of the bathroom, because at least then, there had been nothing to see, nothing to make out. This time, however, most of the lace bra was visible and Blake's eyes had lingered a little too long and allowed her mind to formulate everything the curves represented. She knew Ruby didn't mind at all, that accidents like that happened, and that even she had those thoughts, but hers had lingered during the entire time they spent cleaning the backyard, despite her best attempts to get rid of them. For all the freedom she felt with Ruby, she still couldn't help chastise herself for letting those thoughts continue for so long. She knew that she really needed to get them under control if she was going to keep her self-imposed promise to let Ruby always take that first step. Remnant to Blake. The loud voice of Yang startled her out of her thoughts, and she looked at her partner with confused eyes. Geez, been a while since you dipped out like that. Huh? Blake looked around and saw that they were alone and Yang was collecting the empty plates. She did have a tendency to get lost in her head, but Yang was right in saying that it hadn't happened in a while. Sorry, where did Ruby go? Upstairs to clean up, Yang replied and slipped the plates into the sink. Something bothering you? Not bothering per se. Blake sighed and stood up to walk over to her partner. Just something on my mind. Would that something be this? Yang grinned and pulled the ruined hoodie from the nearby bin. Bet you got an eyeful, huh? Shut up. Blake rolled her eyes as Yang pressed the red fabric against her chest. Oh, come on. You both look so adorable freaking out over a little bra shot. Yang laughed and threw the scorched remains aside. Was standing there trying not to crack when Ruby ran though. Well, it's not funny to me, Blake said firmly, causing the laughter to stop immediately. It's actually a little frustrating. Right. Yang sighed and turned the tap on to wash the plates. Forgot you have that weird thing about Ruby making all the first moves. It's not weird, it's right. Blake countered and handed Yang the washing up liquid. If you say so, Yang shrugged. You'll probably find it weird having this convo with me, and I'm not gonna tell you to go bonk my sister, because that would be even weirder. But what I will say is that if you're waiting for Ruby to make all the first moves, then you will be waiting for a long while. She has no idea what she is doing in that area. We have only just kissed, Yang, Blake argued, pulling open a drawer that Yang was pointing to and taking out a towel. I'm fine waiting a while for whatever comes next. Doesn't mean it's not hard though. That's what he said. Yang chuckled, but quickly raised her arms. Sorry, couldn't resist. But seriously, relationships are a give and take. You both need to take risks and know where those lines are. Ruby will say if it's too far for her, so stop being scared to explore where those lines are if that is what you want. As much as I hate to admit it, Ruby isn't a kid. As Yang washed the dishes, Blake took a second to think on what she had just said. It certainly made more sense than her current decision, but she couldn't help feel hers was more right. She was Ruby's first girlfriend. She deserved the right to explore on her own accord and not because her partner wanted to. You're right, Blake sighed, getting the hint that Yang wanted her to dry the china as the blonde placed them on the counter. Talking to you about this is weird. Can we change the subject? Sure. Yang shrugged again and began on the pan. Wanna tell me what made Ruby rush in like that? Oh, Blake exclaimed, slowly going over the plates to make sure she got every little part. The flower bed broke yesterday in your fight, and she was kinda upset about it. Fuck, the brawler breathed, the disappointment in herself obvious. I didn't even see that. We collected all the parts in a towel outside, if that helps. I'll sort it out later. Yang sighed, placing the now clean pan between the tap and the windowsill to dry on its own. Thanks though. No problem. Blake smiled kindly and placed the towel aside. I'm gonna go clean up too. Alright. Walking away from her partner, she turned back as she reached the door and saw Yang leaning over the counter with her head hung low. Clearly the girl was upset about the flower bed too, so Blake left the room to give her some space. From the sounds of it, Ruby was cleaning up in the upstairs bathroom, so she quickly altered her path to the downstairs when grabbing her things from her backpack in the living room. May as well think about what Yang said while I'm in there.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.